Thank you for joining, and welcome to today's information session hosted by CIET on behalf of the ISO's Save on Energy initiative. My name is Peter Lemoine, and I'll be facilitating today's event. Before we get started, I'd like to go over just a few housekeeping items. First, just make sure your microphone is muted unless you're speaking. Second, this session is scheduled to last 90 minutes. And we'll be monitoring the chat throughout the session for your questions, and we'll address those questions that directly pertain to the slides that are presented. And these slides will also be shared with all attendees after the session. You should receive them early next week. And before we get started on the actual content of today's session, we have a few updates. First, on the Save on Energy programs, and also want to let you know about an upcoming survey. So with regards to the Save on Energy updates, I will now turn over to Rob Edwards of the ISO.
Thank you, Peter. Got 3 slides for you this morning. Just wanted to provide some updates on what the ISO is.
You muted yourself, Robert.
Apologies. How's that? We're good? Okay. Thanks for the invitation today. Carbon is such an important topic in the industry today. So this is very timely for us as well at the ISO. Wanted to provide a few updates on the framework that's going on, as well as some programs that would be applicable to the audience. So the government has awarded the ISO Save on Energy a 12-year, $10.9 billion funding commitment beginning in January. And we're offering this in 4 3-year chunks, if you will. We're moving away from the existing time-bound process that we've had in the past, that is the start-stop model. So it's really wonderful that we're able to provide continuation and consumers can rely on these programs. Pretty much all the programs that we've offered in the previous framework, the 21-24 framework, exist with some additions. And as we move along this year and subsequent years, we will be making updates and changes. An example of some new programs are the Home Renovation Savings Program, Peak Perks for small business, solar PV systems for business. That's a really, really big program, and a lot of people are taking advantage of it. One that we're going to launch in June 2026 is a brand new program, and we just hold a session earlier this week on that information session called the Commercial HVAC Demand Response. So we're looking at helping commercial businesses shed load and get paid for that. Another very interesting component that we're going to be reintroducing is LDCs, local distribution companies, to help us deliver programs throughout the province. Next slide. So we have many programs available to commercial sector, both for consumers and delivery partners, energy service providers. Retrofit program, which would allow you to take advantage of fund incentives to replace inefficient equipment, both through a prescriptive stream, a price per unit, or a custom stream where you can calculate the amount of savings you would have and get paid for that, either per kilowatt or kilowatt hour. The instant discounts program is where you get lighting. The lighting is no longer available really through a retrofit program. So it's a point of sale incentive for these lighting. And we've got about 450 locations across Ontario where you can pick up your lighting and get the incentive at point of sale. Small business program offers, I think, $4,500 or $5,500 for lighting and non-lighting programs, refrigeration and HVAC for small businesses. Many local initiatives across the province in typically constrained areas. So it's really, really important when you look at our website to look at the adders that are available for constrained areas as well as for social housing. The Enhanced Energy Management Program just recently launched funding for, I think it's either 40 or 60 energy managers, and where we're offering up to 50% of the hiring costs for an energy manager at your facility or at your company. Really important that you, if you're interested in this, to get on our website and look at it quickly, because we may sell out the amount of funding that's available for that. We have an existing building commissioning program that provides incentives for investigation, implementation, and persistence of savings. The Energy Performance Program is quite a unique program where it's a holistic approach to energy savings with any facility. A model is built. You do a bunch of good stuff in that facility, whether operational, behavioral, capital, and at the end of the year, we would compare the savings to the model and we would incent you that way. And of course, training and support. We have tremendous amount of incentives available, minimum 50% up to 75% for all sorts of energy focused and carbon focused training. Next. So just wanted to finish with some enhancements, and this is the spring enhancements. We'll be doing this in the fall as well. For those who haven't heard, this is a monumental announcement. The incentives for the custom stream within retrofit has now been increased 50% to $1,800 per kilowatt, or 20 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity saved. It's really an important decision that we've made and introduced this. It's cost effective for us to increase these incentives and help consumers reduce their electricity. I'll share with you that it's about a 300% ROI. For every dollar that we invest in conservation and demand side management, it's a cost avoidance of $3 for generation and transmission of that electricity across the province. So it's our single most cost-effective resource, these incentives available to Ontarians. We have also updates to areas qualifying for regional adders. And again, those are for constrained areas. The incentives are doubled in these areas. Really, really important that that you find out where your projects are, that postal code, go to our website and see if you qualify for these double incentives. Lastly, we know what's going on with AI. We have new computer room measures for these data centers, and I think we'll probably continue to develop those as we go. And we're interested to hear from you. In fact, if you're in this industry and you see what's going on here, we invite you to contact us and help us understand what's going on out there so we can create these enhancements, because we're going to be doing this again in the fall. So that's it for me. I want to leave a couple takeaways with you. All the programs that we offer are delivered by delivery partners. They've bid for these programs. They've been selected through a competitive process. They're being paid to manage these programs on our behalf. Call them, email them, ask for their help. It's their role to help you save energy. The other part is that our website has a ton of information, case studies and how to and webinars, etc. So there's a lot of information there. And feel free to contact me. I am the representative in Save on Energy for the commercial sector. That's commercial real estate, retail, grocery, hospitality, and I can help you understand what's available and steer you to the right partner that we have delivering these programs. So thanks very much for your time. I'm going to stick around and learn about these carbon accounting as well, and happy to take questions if there's time. Peter?
Yeah, actually, thank you so much, Rob. Alan had a clarification question, which is he's asking with regards to the program updates that it's for new applications only. It doesn't apply to applications already submitted.
That's correct.
Okay, and it doesn't look like there's any other direct questions on Save on Energy, although those do come in. I will field them for you. So thanks again.
Very good.
Rob, and now
So
I will just briefly let you know that following this training, you'll be receiving an email from surveyinfo@forumresearch.com to provide feedback on the session, so keep an eye out for that. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's presenter. We have Kyle Aben, who's the owner of Carbon Realities Consulting, who will lead today's information session. He is an expert in climate change with 16 years of experience in greenhouse gas accounting. He's quantified greenhouse gas emissions for companies of all sizes, universities, local governments, communities, heritage sites, and events, including the 2015 Canada Winter Games. He's taught carbon accounting and energy management at the University of Northern British Columbia and at the former Quest University in Squamish. In addition to teaching, Kyle has gained experience working for organizations like the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, the David Suzuki Foundation, and West Fraser Timber. So welcome, Kyle. And with that, I turn it over to you to take us through today's session.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. And it's always nice to start a session, I have to say, with such good news. So thanks, Rob, for starting that. When we hear about incentives, sometimes they're small. You were not talking small figures, so great news there for sure. So welcome everyone on the call. Today we're here to talk about doing a Scope 1 and 2 inventory in the commercial sector. So the objectives for today's training are pretty straightforward. I want to provide you an intermediate level understanding of Scope 1 and 2 emissions, really focus in on the commercial operations and how that differs from other organizations and sectors. I'm going to review some of the key calculation methods and common emission sources that you will see from this sector. And then we're going to talk about how you actually design and build a greenhouse gas inventory. And we're going to use the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and ISO 14064-1. Both are fairly interchangeable, but I would suggest to you that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has a lot more guidance involved with it. The documents are longer. It may express some areas where if you're in a gray area, it might walk you out of it. So yeah, they're both interchangeable, but we will be focused on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol language today. And then the last but not least is to help companies set and prepare emission reduction targets. We don't measure carbon for, just to put the measurement results up on a desk or on a shelf. We do it for a reason, and it is to eventually reduce those emissions that we're creating. So why are footprints important in the commercial sector? We usually always start with compliance with government regulations. I haven't put government here just for the fact that there's all sorts of other regulations that can hit you. If they're voluntary with LEED, the commercial sector may not reach the point of reporting at 25,000 tons per facility or be in the output-based system. But I think we all feel the pressure of secondary and tertiary climate regulations. So they are pushing this along. But the second one that I have listed here may be just as strong a push. And this is the corporate social or environmental and social governance disclosures. So you might have heard of the CDP. It used to be called the Climate Disclosure Project. You can disclose climate, water, and forestry information now. And the number of companies that are disclosing to these are growing astronomically by the day. So there must be a benefit from doing so. And I do think we'll talk about it later, but it's reducing that climate risk that some investors and others are worried about. And then number three, setting internal sustainability goals. A lot of companies and organizations are looking to be a climate champion or at least appear like they're keeping up. So it is important for that point as well. But I do think this last point, it shocks quite a few of us. We thought that the clients, employees, and that would be the driving demand for a lot of carbon information, but it is strongly coming from investors. Investors do see a carbon footprint as information that will alleviate risk. It makes you look into aspects of your organization that you haven't had to before. And really, investors like BlackRock and others, very large investment firms, they seek this information now. So a lot of people are following suit just for that. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to focus on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol guidance today. There's 7 main Kyoto gases that we focus on. If you've heard the list that there was 6, don't worry, that's just a bit of an older list. We added a gas called nitrogen trifluoride just a few years ago. I think it was about a decade ago. It's used in all our LCD screens and our computer screens, and they found it was quite high global warming potential. So there's now 7 now. We do have global warming potentials that are updated regularly. I shouldn't say too regularly. They're from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they come out every about 5 to 7 years. If you notice here, many of the governments are still using the 5th assessment report, so they're using some older global warming potentials. That's only for the fact that it takes some time to readjust. You have to determine whether you're going to go back and change baselines, all this good information. So if you're under any kind of a regulated entity, you use the global warming potentials that are dictated to you, and be very cognizant of that. If you're doing this for a voluntary reason and you're reporting to the CDP, I would say that best practice is to use the latest global warming potentials possible. And a global warming potential is just simply an aspect of each gas and their radiative forcings. In other words, they each contribute to global warming at a different amount. 1 ton of carbon dioxide has an impact, 1 ton of methane has an impact 26 times as great, and 1 ton of nitrous oxide has an impact 266 to 300 times as great. But we'll list some of these later when we have some examples. But just stay cognizant that global warming potentials are important. They do change, and in your management plan, they should be clearly listed. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol groups emissions into 3 categories. And a lot of people have trouble visualizing this or theoretically understanding this, but we do these 3 so that we don't have double accounting within each scope. So a lot of people worry that, scope 3 is double accounting. We're not going to cover that today, but inherently you're right. Scope 3 emissions are some other company or organization's scope 1 or scope 2 emissions. But as I said, today we're not going to get too complicated with scope 3. We're just going to focus on the direct emissions and the indirect emissions. So here's a graph kind of showing them. This is a famous graph from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and in the middle, you clearly see the scope 1 emissions. They're really the emissions that we have most control over. They're not directly released on our site per se. They can also include, your mobile emissions if you have fleet or trucks. But really, they're the ones, the fuel that you're paying for, the things that you're using within your organization. Scope 2, if you follow to the left of the screen, that's the grayed out arrow going up as well. Scope 2 emissions are traditionally thought of as electricity, but it can also include heat, steam, hot water. If you have the ability to connect to a district heating system, then that would be included in scope 2 as well. So usually the language is called purchased energy. But if you only ever recognize that it's electricity, don't be shocked. But some of you in downtown Toronto, with all those great connections, you will be reporting some of that district energy, heat and hot water, steam and cooling on scope 2. And again, if you do have further questions about scope 3, you can notice there's 15 full categories. The accounting is fairly straightforward, like scope 1 and 2, but the complexity of the data and the emission factors is quite a bit greater. So we do have a seminar hopefully coming up in the next little while, and if you're more interested in scope 3, please sign up for that one. So the very first step of any carbon footprint is setting what's called an organizational boundary. As you can imagine, it's quite important to know what's inside your footprint and what is not in your footprint. So this is really the first step to delineate, what is your organization comprised of? And they usually give you 3 different approaches. It's called a financial control approach, an equity share approach, and an operational control approach. But I'm not really going to spend any time on those today because it really is in the commercial sector strongly encouraged to use an operational control approach. There's a few reasons why. Alignment with operational realities. It includes facilities where policies can be implemented. And so what that means is that some of these other controls or options, You may have something in your footprint and you don't have operational control over it. That frustrates people if you're trying to make carbon reductions. And then the last is it only reports emissions from operations you can influence. So again, it excludes operations without that decision-making authority. And it is recommended for commercial reporting through ISO 14000 and both the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And when you look at that perspective, what's included, it usually means it's all company-operated buildings, commercial fleets, and then on-site energy generation, if that happens to be within your privy. What's excluded is uncontrolled leased properties, franchised or outsourced operations, and then shared space with unclear control. And we'll talk a little bit more about leases. Now, again, I just want to stop quickly and say, this is in regards to scope 1 and 2. If you were to do scope 3, some of these things listed as excluded may appear there, but we'll address that later. But really, this is a matrix that's used for a lot of us carbon accountants, and it helps us delineate where the information goes, so where the emission goes, I should say. So if you're under an equity share or financial control, you have to go over and look at what type of lease you have. And you're going to put the emissions in different categories depending on whether it's a financial lease or a capital lease, or financial lease, capital lease, or an operating lease. Where if you look at operational control, for a tenant, it really simplifies things. Depending on what lease it is, it's going to be your scope 1 and 2 as a tenant. And then if you're looking from a landlord perspective, the simplification follows through. You don't have to worry about going up and delineating between a financial lease and an operating lease. Under operational control, it does simplify things. And so putting it on one more table, you just see straightforward, scope 1, 2, 1, 2, scope 3 and 3. So, that matrix, like I said, it's used quite often depending on what organizational boundary you've chosen. But really, the main reason why ISO is recommending this, and the main reason GHG Protocol recommends it, is that it just simplifies things. And the tenant takes responsibility for scope 1 and 2 emissions, and the landlord reports emissions under scope 3, regardless of lease type. Now, again, I do have to warn you, if you were to go back to these matrices and found them online, and we do have references at the end, there are some caveats. If you can prove that you are a landlord but do have full control, there are some ways to include that. But really, for the most part, this is the reason why we go with operational control. Do I have any questions at this point, Peter?
Let me double check the chat, but I didn't see any directly relevant at this moment. No, so I think we can carry ahead, Kyle.
Thank you very much. Okay, so the scope of emissions. We talked about these a bit earlier, but we're going to go into the depth of each one and talk about what can show up. So as we said, scope 1 emissions are the direct greenhouse gas emissions from sources owned or controlled by the organization. Scope 2 emissions are the indirect greenhouse gas emissions from the generation of purchased energy consumed by the organization. So, we know those emissions are being created elsewhere, but we know we're responsible as soon as we flick that light switch, right? We're the ones using that electricity. So wonderful to hear Rob talk about all those incentives for reduction. And I have heard amazing things about demand side management, but not a 3-to-1. So that's great news. Okay, so we're going to focus on scope 1 for a little bit. And I think we have someone with an unmuted mic. If you could make sure you're muted, that would be great. Thank you very much. Okay, so scope 1 emission sources, usually thought of as a stationary fuel combustion. In this regard, we'll go over mobile emissions next. But for stationary fuel combustion, I think almost all of us just think natural gas. And you're right to think that. We've had a proliferation of it across Canada, Ontario. But we can't exclude or forget about these other things, right? We still have propane, common in rural and temporary buildings. Fuel oil is still used in some of the older heating systems. We have diesel for backup generators and for heating at some cases. And then biomass and wood combustion, less common for commercial, but again, if you're connected to a district heating system and it's biomass, then that's a good thing. I won't discuss how to handle biomass. If you're burning it directly for your own operations, you report the CO2 component outside of the boundary, and you report the nitrous and the methane within. But there's clear guidance on biomass when you do reach that stage. So the next group of Scope 1 emissions is mobile fuel combustion. And these are burned from vehicles and equipment owned and controlled by the organization. Gasoline and diesel for cars, trucks, and shuttles. Propane used in forklifts and other warehouse equipment. Natural gas, compressed natural gas vehicles. And then refrigerated delivery trucks, those auxiliary engines that are running. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, refrigerant, in the next slide. But that is something where usually refrigeration, if you're in a big industrial facility, usually the refrigeration's a small component. But for a commercial operation, it can be significant. So we can't forget about it for Scope 1 emissions, and we have to look into those leaks. HVAC systems, air conditioners and heat pumps, refrigerated display cases at a grocery store or a pharmacy, cold storage or walk-in freezers, ice machines or commercial chillers. And here's a list of some of the common refrigerants. We'll do an example of R410A a little later. But you can see there's all different groups, and the R22 is phased out, but it might be still in use. So we'll talk about how to get some of this information later, and it's not the easiest up front sometimes, but it's part of those processes we're going to put in place that we are able to capture this over years. So another Scope 1 emission, really it's less common in the commercial sector, but the commercial sector between hospitality, all these different organizations within it, you never know. So I just thought I'd list it. It's still relevant for some specialized buildings, such as, on-site CO2 from compressed gas use. So in labs, beverage carbonation, and then emissions from dry ice sublimation. So used in biotech and cold chain logistics. So again, very rare, but just making sure that you are cognizant that it is out there. So I thought I'd do a few examples for Scope 1, just so you can see some mathematics behind the scene. And this is just simply a grocery store using 250,000 cubic meters of natural gas per year. Now, there's a few things I want to mention on this slide. First off is, the emission factors. Always get the best emission factor you can. So if we're in Canada, we're going to use our ones from Environment and Climate Change Canada. If we have some within the province that are even more specific, great. But it is your due diligence to go and look at the best emission factors possible. You can assume for something like burning natural gas, you're going to have a very similar emission factor throughout the globe. It's the stoichiometry, it's the science behind it. But for things like electricity, it's going to vary all over the place. So be cognizant of those. As well, you see only 3 gases listed here, even though I've told you that there's 7 Kyoto gases. That's not uncommon as well. These are the 3 most dominant that you'll see in a lot of carbon footprints. If you don't see any more, don't be shocked. But we will see a little bit more of the hydrofluorocarbons when we look at refrigeration. But these are the 3 that you really do see dominant in a lot of footprints. Again, I think I've just used the global warming potentials from AR5, since they're the most common ones that you'll run into at this point until we do make our change to AR6. So you take the emission factor, and you can see line by line here, CO2 is quite easy. You take the cubic meters of natural gas and you multiply it by the emission factor that we have per cubic meter of natural gas, and it comes out to a CO2 number. But what I really wanted to make a point of is that it's strongly advised, it's strongly considered best practices now to list out all of your gases individually. So although your final carbon footprint number is only going to have one number called CO2e, which is a combination of all your gases, SBTi, CDP, TCFD, all of these reporting organizations now want you to separate the gases. So you can take a look and see how many tons of methane you had, how many tons of nitrous, how many tons of CO2 in themselves. So to do that second calculation, it's straightforward like the first, but you do need to add that global warming potential. And so that's why we see CH4 as methane. We see the calculation above similar to CO2, but we need to add that global warming potential of 28 because we know it has that 28 times worse effect on global warming. The radiative forcing is stronger. And then we do the same for the nitrous oxide. And so we total all of those up to get our CO2e. You know, you'll be using software, or you're going to hear me try and convince you to use Excel for the first year or two as well. It's just a really good backing. But you'll have all this, you know, laid out. But I just wanted to make sure that everyone's understood that don't just look for a CO2e factor. You do need to look for factors that have all the gases broken up. It's not always the case. And I'll show you an example, I think, a little later. But when at all possible, break out all gases so we can have a total of each individually. So again, CO2e is just a combination, so we're combining apples and apples, and you have to get there by adding that global warming potential. So I'll show you another example for mobile fuel use. Very similar. This one's per liter. So when you're looking at your mobile fuel, you know, you might only have a spend base. You might only have the total amount of dollars spent in a year on fuel. Well, then you have to go back and look at the average price of fuel per the year, go back and try and calculate out to liters. You might only have the total kilometers driven. Well, then you need to look at the efficiency of the vehicles driven, back that out and try and get to liters. If you do get to liters, you're at a very good spot. It's a kind of a high level of activity data, as we call it. And so the emission factors here, you can see it's a dominant one for CO2, right? 2.3 kilograms per liter spent. But yet the methane and the nitrous are quite small, 0.00006, 0.0039 for nitrous. But again, you have to multiply by those global warming potentials, so it doesn't come out to zero. But again, those arrows, the yellow arrows, are to note where you are including that global warming potential. And so you can see the, 11.7 kilograms of nitrous does turn into 3,100 kilograms of CO2 by the time your calculation's over. But even then, out of the 72,000 kilograms, it's a small portion. You'll usually find that, and that's why we revert everything back to CO2. It's not just the dominant gas in our atmosphere, it's usually the dominant gas that we're measuring as well. Okay, so enough of the making sure you have the gases lined up, but it is important for your reporting moving forward. And if you are chasing higher scores, it is a step you need to take. So refrigerant use. So unlike fuel combustion, these leaks are from hydrofluorocarbons with sometimes very, very high global warming potentials, hundreds into the thousands sometimes. And if you want a full list of global warming potentials, I do encourage you just to type in IPCC global warming potentials over time. And it has a great list showing you their variation, their updates, and their significance of some of these different gases. But when refrigerants leak from HVAC or cooling system, the total emissions are calculated by multiplying the mass of the refrigerant leaked by its global warming potential to express the resultant carbon dioxide equivalent. So we're going to look at an example of a mall losing 10 kilograms of R410 refrigerant per year. So we have this example. R410 is actually a blend of two different coolants. So we have to look into their IPCC has all these for refrigerants. I'm not sure if Environment Canada has so many specific. They probably have a weighted average, but so we take that out. We look at 50% R32 with a lower global warming potential, much lower than the R125. Hopefully in the future we can go to 60% R32, or these are how we start looking at our reductions. But the weighted average is a global warming potential of 2,088 kilograms of CO2e per kilogram of R410A released. So straightforward calculation, if we can confirm through our maintenance supervisors, through the people looking after the refrigeration that it was 10 kilograms released, then it's a fairly straightforward calculation. And as you can see, it does add up, 20.88 tons for 10 kilograms. So again, just gives you a little indication of how some of these gases are incredibly potent compared to others, and why there's a strong push to look for blends like R32 with a lower global warming potential, to completely get rid of R22 and some of those ancient ones that are terrible. So be cognizant of refrigerant leaks. We'll talk about it again later. Sometimes it's hard data to get, but I'll have some suggestions for how to improve that as well. Okay, I'll move on to scope 2 now. Yeah, so
Kyle, we do actually have a few questions that might be a good point
to
pause since we're now through with scope 1. First of all, Alan asks, for mobile emissions, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share regarding renewable natural gas or hydrogen?
Yeah, absolutely. Lower carbon impact. The more you can move to them, the better. If you were to look at the carbon factor or the emission factor for a renewable natural gas or compressed natural gas compared to diesel, say, much, much lower. So yeah, I like those options, but I do have to be honest that whenever I talk about natural gas, people tell me that it's a bridge fuel. And I agree, but I always try and suggest to keep the bridge as narrow and as short as possible, because it is still a fossil fuel. But anywhere that we can seek reductions that from our current status is a good thing, no question.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kyle. And Al asks, what is typically the source of the refrigerant leaks? Their closed system, so to speak.
Yeah, they're not always closed. So there's leaks out of elbows and pipes, and the longer the systems go. And so, yeah, unfortunately, refrigerant leaks aren't perfect because if it is a complete sealed system, that's what we're hoping for. And we're hoping for very little leaks. In common practice, that's not always the case.
And finally, Bara asks, why do you consider meters cubed instead of kilograms for calculating methane emissions?
So it depends on the activity data. So if it's natural gas, we're using meter cubed. Doesn't matter for really methane. Methane, we have a factor for whatever we're looking at, liters, cubic meters, whatever it may be. So maybe I'm misinterpreting that question, but yeah, so we'll use whatever factor we need for methane, but it's not always in cubic meters.
Great, thank you, Kyle. And I think we can move on to scope 2.
Okay, thank you. And a lot of times, if you do have gas in cubic meters and you have your data in gigajoules, well, then you do have to use that conversion. And I would always suggest using the conversion factor that accompanies that emission factor. Okay, scope 2 emission sources. So as I said, it can include other things, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. But traditionally, it is really focused on purchased electricity. So used in offices, retail, warehouses, hotels, schools, hospitals, data centers. The Ontario grid is low carbon, and we should stop for a moment to give Ontario credit where credit's due. The phase out of coal-powered electricity is probably the single greatest climate action in North America. The reduction in carbon it had was unbelievable. But what's even more unbelievable is the increased outcomes of health. No smog days after it was let out. They estimate up to $1 billion in savings in healthcare. So a lot of these climate initiatives that we do have ancillary benefits, and kudos to Ontario for making sure their grid's low carbon and getting rid of coal-powered electricity. So location-based, you'll notice at the very bottom I have two different options. Traditionally, we've measured electricity based on a location-based. And what that means is, we've taken an average provincial grid factor, and you see the one there for Ontario. So what they've done is they've taken all the producers in Ontario, they've made an estimate of their carbon impact and spread that out over every kilowatt hour sold. So we do that great. But a lot of places, the location is either too large or too averaged out. And so we now have the option, what's called a market-based method of accounting for electricity. And what this does is lets you get a little more particular, a little more detailed on where you're getting your power from. So if you're buying from a green power source, you have renewable energy certificates, you've bought a solar farm, you can actually make those adjustments here in your market-based assessment. So the CDP, SBTI, and others are suggesting that best practice is to list both. But if you are setting a target, the SBTI only says use one. And you can suggest at this point, or you can realize that almost all companies are using the market-based. When you hear companies like Google and Microsoft and the rest saying they're going to be completely green power by this certain point, they're definitely using a market-based accounting approach. It's not a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing because a lot of these target setting organizations won't let you use offsets, but they will let you use renewable energy credits because it's stimulating that renewable energy market. So be careful. But at this point, all I'd suggest is do both. Use your location-based average that you have from NRCan each year, or if your province does a more specific one, great. But then the market-based really lets you put into those the categories of what you're purchasing and reduce that Scope 3 or Scope 2 emissions tremendously. So as I mentioned, there's other categories of Scope 2 though, and so don't forget about them. Downtown Toronto, a lot of buildings are connected to these district energy systems, common in institutional campuses as well. And then it depends on the fuel source, of course. We'd love if there are biomass, electricity even, but a lot are still natural gas. But even at that point, as I mentioned, the efficiencies from a centralized and efficient chiller or boiler, it's a really good thing, a district energy system, rather than having all this separate equipment being serviced and maintained. And so when possible, we really do enjoy that connection, but it should be reported under your Scope 2 emissions, not under your Scope 1. And then other Scope 2 cases, electricity for common areas and leased buildings, and then lighting for shared parking lots and signage. We can't forget about that, and someone's paying those bills. So I have an example for you from a grid electricity use. So this is a location-based. So we see the factors for Ontario above. We have them for CO2, we have them for CH4, and we have it for N2O. And so the calculations for an office tower using 1 million kilowatt hours of electricity per year. Again, the three straightforward. I won't spend any time on the yellow iterations. I think I've made my point about us breaking up gases and the importance of it. But you can see in Ontario, 1 million kilowatt hours, it does have an impact. That's still 38 tons of CO2e per year. But I can suggest that if you were to use the factors from Ontario or Alberta or another higher impact province, that would at least triple, maybe even quadruple. I think BC and Quebec are some of the only provinces lower than Ontario. But as I mentioned, those factors can vary widely. So be careful and make sure it's your obligation to look for the best possible factor that you can find. For electricity, sometimes it's straightforward, but the market-based approach, make sure that you have the data and the paperwork to back up what you're suggesting. If you've purchase or have a power purchase agreement, have those details for the verifier ready so that they can confirm them. So I do have an example on district energy here, and we have to be a bit careful because this is an example where we don't have the best factor that we'd like. And so what I suggest by that is that the emission factor here, if you read it at the top, it's saying 56.1 kilograms of CO2e per gigajoule, inclusive of all gases. So it's suggesting it's gone through and it's taken a look at CO2, it's looked at methane, it's looked at nitrous, and it's giving you a CO2e factor. So remember, my comments are to try and avoid a CO2e factor when possible, but for something like district energy, that's maybe all you have. And so you have to kind of go with what you have. And so below the emission factor, you can see a breakdown of the greenhouse gases on a typical combustion ratio. So if we wanted an aggregated and we just wanted that total CO2e number, you can see the calculation up top is very straightforward. We take the number of gigajoules used and we calculate by that CO2e factor. And we get our 448,800 kilograms of CO2e. If we did want to break it up, like traditionally we've been talking about, that we want to have the ability to list these three separate gases separately, then we actually have to go to those combustion ratios and just break them up by that. And so we multiply them by those. Um, I hope your gut's screaming at you right now that that's probably not the most efficient way to do so. If we had the actual emission factors for each CO2, CH4, and N2O, it would be much more accurate, because we are rounding the edges, just taking an emission combustion ratio here. And I would even suggest that CH4 and N2O, currently at 2,200 kilograms and 3,100 kilograms, would probably be dramatically reduced if we used a proper factor. But again, in carbon accounting, we're always on the conservative side, and we're always making sure that we attribute at least enough emissions to each group. So yeah, just be careful on these. If we would have preferred a district energy factor here for each one of those, but if it's a CO2e, we're going to live with it, and we're going to disaggregate it the best that we can. Okay, so a market-based example. So really, it's a very basic slide, but I just wanted to impress it in your mind. This is why people love the market-based approach, and it leads to that ability to really stimulate a clean electricity market, and that's the goal of it. So if your full electricity is backed by renewable energy certificates, you have those certificates in hand, you can show a verifier, then there is no calculation for you. It's 0, 0, 0. So a lot of companies, of course, are moving to that blend. They're gonna, Microsoft and Google are claiming that by a certain point, there will be 100% green electricity. So just a quick example there of the benefit of using a market-based approach and the opportunities to purchase green electricity. If there's an initial reduction in a carbon footprint that can be had, a lot of people are looking at this as the first step. Maybe I'll stop there and ask if there's any questions, Peter, before I move on to data challenges.
Yes, Kyle, we actually have two questions. The first one from Patrick, who asks, why are the indirect emissions from fossil fuels not considered in Scope 2?
Well, I would suggest to you that they are. So they're the upstream fossil fuels that have used to purchase or to create that electricity. So there's someone else's Scope 1 emissions, but they're being measured down the line. So we're making sure that we calculate all the emissions that are created or generated from that electricity to be produced in a usable format for us. And a lot of that is backup generation, or does include some fossil fuel. So yeah, we're not avoiding it by any means. And that's why some of these greenhouse gas factors are higher than others provincially. Some are still a lot more based on fossil fuel.
And Olga asks, where can emission factors be found?
Yeah, we have some references at the end of this document, Olga, Emissions and Climate Change Canada, but they're all over the place, really. I always start with our most local ones in Canada, but, DEFRA, EPA, they're all over, and they're getting more advanced by the day. And the other ones that I suggest is Greenhouse Gas Protocol themselves. A lot of there's templates and things that they have for you to use will lead to greenhouse gas factors. But yeah, be careful. Make sure they're from a authorized or legitimate source. But they are getting easier to find. And as I said, we have some references at the end of this presentation for you that will help you.
And Olga, just so you know, we'll be providing this slide deck to all participants after the training, probably on Monday. And one final question, Kyle. Should one also factor burner efficiency as you're considering 100% burning in ideal conditions when calculating methane combustion?
Yeah, you should calculate for efficiencies for sure. And depending on what kind of organization, institution, manufacturing, those will change for sure. But yeah, make sure you're getting your efficiency of the burn, and that will be included in the factors that you have as well. So they'll have one for partial efficiencies and go down the scale. Methane has quite a few new factors. They actually bridge them up into fossil methane and biological methane as well now. So yeah, be very careful when you're picking a methane factor, but it should include your combustion ratio indeed.
Great. Thank you, Kyle. And that's all the questions for now.
Okay, thank you. So now I have 3 slides coming up on data collection challenges. You know, a lot of people undertake these and they start rolling their eyes and they take that deep breath and they just don't know where to start. But for scope 1 and 2, it's fairly straightforward. You know, you're in control of a lot of this. You're having to pay these bills. But the problem is a lot of times they're fragmented. So energy data may come in from multiple vendors or systems, the Enbridge, Hydro One, sub-metered of tenants, come in different formats, PDF, Excel, web portals, just a standard bill, all sorts of things. So making the time or the consolidation time consuming. And then the lack of centralized data tracking across departments. So, you know, energy department may be registering or noting things different than your facilities, different than finance and accounting. So that takes time to kind of look into and understand where you have some efficiencies and where you have some issues that you're going to need to correct. The next data challenge is unmetered or shared lease spaces. And I'm sure many of you on the phone are thinking, yeah, this is a tough one. But commercial tenants may not have access to whole building utility data. Leases may not specify energy use responsibilities. And landlord-controlled utilities will complicate boundary settings when we talked about scope 1 versus scope 3. So, you know, if it is a energy generation on site, just remember that there's guidance for that and to be a bit careful. But above, you know, it's not the end of the world. A lot of times landlords do not want to disclose their information about their building as well. And so if we don't have that information, Environment and Climate Change Canada does at least have some factors based on square footage or square meters. So if you don't have anything else, you can at least get an estimate based on that. Again, it will be an average, and it will probably be an average that's a little bit above the actual, but it's still something you can deal with as you're moving forward. As I said, you don't want to avoid going forward just because you have some issues. What's that expression? Analysis by paralysis. We want to just start moving forward and understand that we're going to have to be transparent about some of the things we're working on. And the next slide, missing historical records. You know, previous bills are not always archived properly. Building ownership changes can result in data loss. And without 12 months of data, annual baseline calculations and benchmarking, it becomes very difficult, as you can understand. So we do want to make sure that, you know, the first iteration of our footprint is probably private. We're working out some bugs. We're searching for that 12 months of data. We're looking for our gaps. But from that point, you know, we can start addressing some of these issues. And to improve the data quality, you know, Energy Star Portfolio Manager is just unbelievable, really. And I'm sure many of you on the phone are using it now. It enables, or Energy Star enables standardized energy and emissions tracking. There's Excel and custom greenhouse gas inventory tools when more flexibility is needed. And then again, the units. It's funny, but you know, people are building these spreadsheets and these inventory management plans, and they're not listing units with clarity, and no one else can guess on units. It's just one of those things that you have to be very clear. And from a professor at a university, I can tell you it's the first thing I look for to dock marks. But in the real world, it's the first thing to cause considerable issues. Is it a kilowatt hour? Is it a gigawatt hour? Is it cubic meter? Is it a gigajoule? Is it a liter? Is it a spend based? You have to know these things for sure. But once you do have that full year, you can start really looking at some of these other gaps. And so improving quality or data quality, request full utilities history. So push back, even if the building has been sold, maybe you can go back and contact that utility provider and look for the 12 months of historical data. You know, you do need at least a couple years usually. You want to add in the degree days and the variability in heating. And so to support the year-over-year comparisons and accurate baseline development, you need that consistency over a couple of years. You're always going to be setting your baseline to a most common year. So something that really represents your usual business, but you don't want to go back too far in time as well, or the data does get suspect. And then it's useful for newly acquired buildings or those with historical reporting gaps. So again, anything you can do to fill in those blanks, that's your job to do so. And then the last slide on improving data quality, engage facility teams and centralize tracking. And so facilities and maintenance staff are often the key to a lot of this usage. They know what you're using. They know if your refrigeration has leaks or not. They know about your forklift being terrible. These are people you do have to make sure that you do a bit of sleuthing with. You're a bit of a detective. You're asking them about the operations. A lot of times, generally, I always suggest that accounting and finance is your friend. But in the commercial sector, it's a little bit different. And although they will be your friend, facilities and maintenance staff are just as key. Centralized data collection, so via shared drives or dashboard, can improve some consistency. And again, though, this takes time. You don't want to just let all your different buildings or your organization parts throw you data that they've already calculated and assume that they're all carbon accountants. You do want to start from a decentralized or a centralized approach where everyone's sending you the information. You're doing the final calculation. You're looking at any conversion, global warming potential. Over time, as you work out the bugs and see where they're getting the data from, well, the hope is that the software helps you just collect their bill and it automatically goes in. The dashboard's updated automatically. If there's any of you on the phone who are working on this now, it's not as easy as I just made it sound, but it is the goal for a lot of us, right? We want to make sure that the data that we have is automated to the most we can, and that people who have been working on this can go work on other things. But it is important, as I mentioned here, there has to be an owner of the data. And I've used here the term data custodian, but someone needs to be clearly identified who's doing this job. And as well, they're not just not handling the data, they're handling the inventory management plan. So please don't forget that we need to start this inventory management plan at the day one. It calculates or notes everything that we're doing, who we're talking to get data, who's provided the data, not their name, but their title in case there's company turnover. So I haven't really put a separate slide for an inventory management plan here, but please be cognizant that it's not something that's voluntary. You do need to have one as part of this process, or you will be in a bit of trouble. Okay, the next, I just have three really basic examples of different typical things in Ontario that can happen. So an office...
Kyle, could we pause just briefly for two questions?
Yeah, certainly, Peter. Thank you.
This is actually a follow-up from Patrick, who had previously asked about indirect emissions from fossil fuels not being considered in Scope 2. He says to clarify that question, that they consider emissions used in generating electricity that they consume on site, but how do they consider emissions associated with delivering natural gas or other fuels to buildings, to their own buildings?
Yeah, so we calculate that if it's not included in your Scope 1 emission. So we're hoping that natural gas emission that you're using is what's called a well to burning. So a lot of times the factor that we're using for natural gas, and the one that I showed you, is this is just stoichiometry for burning it on site. But there is an impact to get that gas to you in a usable state, right? The exploration, the development, the transportation, the refinement. Those are all captured in what's called Scope 3 category of fuel and other related activities. As I mentioned, we're hoping that it is included in your Scope 1, that everything in that process is. It's a lot more best practices to include, and even for fuel, it's called well to wheel, where traditionally we've only calculated tank to wheel. So if we're only calculating tank to wheel, we need to include the well to the tank in that Scope 3. So again, I'm probably adding a bit of complexity here, but yes, don't worry that emissions are being missed. A full carbon footprint, including those supply chain emissions, will capture them. But at this point, we're just focusing on the Scope 1 and 2 emissions that we have most control over.
Thank you, Kyle. And James asks, if buying electricity credits for only part of your consumption, for example, clean energy credits for half of electricity use, should you be using location-based factors for the remainder or residual mix?
Yeah, very good. So you're not always going to have your market-based factors for all of your stuff, and it's usually always a combination. Absolutely. So do your best if you're using a market-based approach to get those factors. A lot of times you'll see in the United States, they even have more small iterative geographic areas with market-based factors. But yeah, very good insight. You can't always rely on all of them. So if you have half of yours in renewable energy credits and you're searching for a factor for the other half and it's only location, go about and use that. What we do is we usually mark on our market-based approach that that's what's happened, because always we're just very transparent about what we're doing. But yeah, very common practice. Good question.
And he follows up by asking, are there good residual mix emissions factors for Ontario?
I don't think I would be able to give you a qualified information on that. So yeah, I would say take a look, and even unbelievably, this is where AI can be quite good too. Type that into a chat GPT. But myself, I don't know if there's higher enough quality at this point in Ontario to suggest that I would say where to look. So sorry about that one.
Okay, thank you, Kyle. That's all for now, and we can move on.
Okay. So just like I said, 3 really basic examples. So the standard office in Ontario, multi-tenanted downtown office tower, we're going to have scope 1 and 2 emissions. So scope 1 is going to be your natural gas for your space heating and your boilers. Scope 2 is going to be your purchased electricity for lighting, HVAC, and plug loads. And then just a note here that, common to use Energy Star Portfolio Manager for tracking. So this is just a very typical one. But we know we have all these different examples of what can happen within an office building, depending on who's using it. So be careful, do your due diligence and be a bit of a detective, but these are just the basic ones that you're going to see at an office. In a supermarket, it changes a bit, right? Scope 1, we might have a pretty dominant refrigerant leak with if it's an older supermarket. So we can't forget about those. We're going to do our best to measure them the best we can. Scope 1, diesel generator for backup power. And again, probably more than likely using natural gas as well. And then Scope 2 for electricity use. Electricity use, significant, right? In the lighting, refrigeration, and HVAC. So the age of the supermarket and the number of storage facilities, cold storage probably dictates that, but they're going to have information on that as well as they have their service records, and you'll know what to do with the refrigerants. And then just the last quick example, a hotel in Ontario, district heating or connected to a district heating. So it's a full service hotel in downtown Toronto. Scope 1 emissions would be the refrigerant leaks from room HVACs and walk-in fridges. I would suggest to you that it might come out to be less than 1% and onerous to account for. And so I wanted to teach you that rule in carbon accounting. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol has that very clear, that if you have an emission source and it's less than 1% of your total footprint and it's onerous to account for, they'll let you exclude it. But you do have to mark it. You do have to show the mathematics of why you do believe it's less than 1%, and prove that to the verifier. But I think if it is a good closed system, like we've talked about already, one of the questions, it's a newer hotel, it would be very small. So it might have almost no Scope 1 inputs, this hotel, because if it's connected to the district energy system, it's getting its hot water for heating and domestic hot water. And then perhaps, again, significant electricity use for HVAC, air conditioning in the summer, elevators, lighting, and their commercial laundry. So you might have an example where it's a full Scope 2 assessment, but it would be rare. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a few examples that myself and others have learned as best practices through the time of carbon accounting. So we talked about this a bit, but refrigerant tracking is often missing. And so it's your job to kind of implement things to make sure that it's not missing anymore. So talk to those people who are servicing the HVACs. And so many commercial buildings lack the proper systems to log refrigerant purchases, leaks, top-ups, and it leads to underreported Scope 1 emissions. So if we know that at this point we don't have the data, we're going to include that in our carbon footprint, and we're going to be very upfront about it. We're going to let them know that we're working on solving this problem, but at this point, we do not have the information. And then from that point forward, you do have to make sure that everyone involved, procurement, your service, or the people who are servicing your HVAC, know that from this point forward, you very much want to calculate that information, and if there is any top-ups, any leaks, you do want to know about it, and do want to know what's been added to your system. So these standardized tracking logs and automatic sensors or monitors, it takes time to put in place. You don't have to do it overnight, but as long as you do have a momentum towards rectifying the problem, that's usually, what we consider best practices. Carbon footprint is not a static thing, right? It's an iterative process. And each year, you're going to look at your emission factors. You're going to try and improve things. You're going to make it better. And so each year, you're hoping for more accuracy and more quality. So property managers need support. We found this a lot of times, the words carbon accounting just kind of scare them. They haven't heard it before. They have all these other constraints they're already working on. But a lot of them are very happy to hear that, Energy Star Portfolio Manager does have a carbon component to it. They've already been putting information in there. But they do need to have training, whether it's something like this today, or whether they need time to review the greenhouse gas corporate strategies, review how it specifically affects the corporate sector. They do need some help. So if we can provide that training, templates, guidance documents tailored to their operations, that's going to help move things along. So again, it's just a knowledge transfer where you can. Wisdom doesn't come without action, and so we need to train them. We need to have them in a good spot where they can help reduce this carbon footprint and not cause problems accounting for it. Benchmarking helps target emissions. So this should be really clear. All these companies are setting a benchmark and a base year for a reason. They want to be able to compare things over time. If your emissions go up, you should know why. If they go down, you should know why. So these are things that, again, Energy Portfolio Manager, with that greenhouse gas component, it's a very handy tool. But there's other ones, greenhouse gas protocols and others do have tools, and I'll talk about a few of those in the next 2 slides as well. But if you're not using a portfolio manager, in the commercial sector, I would suggest that it's probably good practice to learn it now and jump on it. It's a very powerful tool. Okay, so I've already talked about that one.
Cal, can we pause briefly just for one question?
Yes, absolutely.
Here?
Yeah, thanks, Peter.
So Benjamin asks, should fuels used for emergency power generation on site be included in Scope 1? These systems are often annually tested and consume small quantities of fuel each year, even if it's not used for actual emergency situations.
Yeah, absolutely. We always include that in Scope 1. So any backup diesel, any backup use, you're still burning the site on, or you're still burning the fuel, you're paying for it, and there's a reason for it, right? You're doing it to make sure that you have that backup when needed. Yeah, good question, but definitely Scope 1.
Thanks, Kyle. And oh, wait, sorry, one more question just came in. I'll have to follow up on this one.
Certainly.
So why don't we go ahead, and then we'll we can circle back to it.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, so the other tools I wanted to mention. Oh, here we go. What slide am I on here? There we go, Energy Star. So I mentioned Energy Star. The greenhouse gas protocol, as I've mentioned, they seem like they've had every question asked of them and they have an answer written down somewhere. And I know that's not always the case, and I'm exaggerating, but I can suggest to you that, if you do have a question about greenhouse gas accounting, it's the first place to start. And the templates they have, the sectoral guidance they have, just fantastic. So please, if you're ever doing any carbon accounting, you do need to be familiar with the greenhouse gas protocol. The corporate standard is, I need a better word, but it's the Bible for all of us that we use. Almost all regulations are based on that accounting standard, and it is fungible with ISO 14064-1, as I mentioned. The next couple I'll mention, RETScreen. I noticed on the attendance sheet that there's a lot of energy managers on the phone, so they know how powerful RETScreen can be. It was developed by NRCan. It's a free software energy analysis, so it really helps with feasibility assessment. So cost-benefit analysis is between two different options. It includes Scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas calculations. And in Ontario, used a lot for retrofit evaluations. You want to take a look and see, what is this retrofit going to result in energy use-wise? I've been in RETScreen a little bit, but I cannot say that I know it enough to ever teach it or suggest how to go forward, but I know those who use it love it. And then energy management information systems, whatever they may be. Some Ontario businesses are implementing real-time energy management information systems with a dashboard that everyone can see. They're managed by the minute as soon as a bill comes in. And so Save on Energy offers rebates for these systems, and I'll let you look into those. But yeah, the more we can have a hold of our information, know where it's coming from, know why we're using the outputs, and always constantly looking to improve the quality, that's where we want to be. Okay, let me take a look here. We got it. I think we're all right for time here. So from measurement to action, I won't spend too much time on setting an emissions target. I think I have 3 or 4 slides here, but what I wanted to mention is the company on the right that you see, Science Based Target Initiatives. It was built off the Paris Agreement. And if you haven't been following, international climate negotiations, we call it every year what's called a Conference of the Party. That's when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and all the members meet. And so the first big one we always knew about was Kyoto. It set a 6% reduction from 1990 levels by 2008. There's very few countries that actually made that or met that. So what the Paris Agreement said was, well, let's, instead of reductions of carbon dioxide, let's have a target of a increase in global warming. Let's set it to 1.5 degrees or well below 2-degree pathway. We know that past 2 degrees, then we're going to have a lot of feedback loops and a lot of extra concerns. So that's where the Science-Based Target Initiative comes from. And it is what we consider the gold standard target setting in the world. So it's very stringent. They validate your own target. You have to apply to them to do so. And you don't always have to use it, right? A lot of companies do believe they're too stringent. And especially if you notice on the bottom that if you do a full estimation of your carbon footprint, if your Scope 3 emissions are 40% of your total or more, they must be included. And so a lot of companies want to set a target before they even measure Scope 3. But all I'm suggesting is that the science-based target is the toughest one. And if you ever want to know the rules behind it and even their net zero process, it is a tough one to follow. But a lot of companies are moving towards it because they want that validation process and ensure the target aligns with the science-based goals. And having a third party validate your target lends a lot of credibility to it. So from measurement to action, there's other goals. We have the net zero challenge. A lot of people are confused by net zero. All it really means is it's a bit of a harder target than carbon neutrality. For an organization, you have to reduce your emissions almost by 90% and then offset the residual. They do have different things for green building codes, the Canadian Green Building Code. So, look into those, but net zero is a further target, usually a 2050 target, but a lot of times they make you do that iterative target in the meantime. That's the one a lot of people like setting with SBTI as well. And then internal carbon budgeting, whether it's an internal carbon price or other methods, it really does encourage ownership of emissions and enables decentralized planning. It gets people a bit more involved, right, when they can see these things and see that they can have a part in a reduction or have a hand in it. But when you do set a target, there's usually, many different ways to do so. And the number one is the top, and that's what's called an absolute target. We're going to reduce our emissions by an absolute amount by 50% by 2030 from a 2020 baseline. And so this would be in line with, as I mentioned, their most stringent one, the SBTI target of a 1.5 degree pathway. But you may have an intensity target. You know, a commercial sector maybe not, but if you're out in a manufacturer, that might really be more applicable to you. But as we see here, even in commercial, reduce emissions per cubic foot or square foot by 30% by 2028. There's also embodied carbon targets that you can have, but we won't discuss those today, a different method of accounting. Equipment switches, so all electricity or electrify all gas-fired HVAC by 2023 or 2035. Again, some of these components in the net zero challenge allow you to do that. And then one you're really hearing common, you know, as I said, a lot of these larger companies, it's the procurement goal. So their goal is to purchase 100% renewable energy by a certain period. So we have options to do that and best practices. So I just wanted to mention those as the, you know, 4 different options for target setting. Those of us in the field are always trying to look for an absolute target. I have to admit, we believe that they have the most effect. Intensity based, you know, it's not that you can greenwash that information, but you might have tremendous growth in your overall greenhouse gases, but still have a reduction in intensity. If you are a super growth company, then maybe that's what you do have to look for. Okay, I just have 2 more slides, and then perhaps we can take some questions. Key takeaways from today. Scope 1 and 2. You know, it's the foundation for net zero, but it's not all of it. But as I suggest, you know, start where you can. And direct emissions and purchased energy are typically the most controlled and within your control to account for. So it's the logical starting point for any net zero strategy or any carbon reduction strategy. Use operational control. It's recommended for the commercial sector, and we've really seen why. With all those complex ownership structures and different leases, it really does simplify things for us. So don't worry about choosing one, just roll with operational control. And then reliable data plus tools equals success. And some of you are probably laughing that that's very basic and obvious, but it does take some time, you know, to make sure that the data you have is reliable. You may be using spend-based metrics for a little while until you get that good activity data. And the tools you use, you may realize that the first software provider you use or template isn't the best one for you. But as I suggested earlier, if you have the wherewithal to include an Excel spreadsheet, they're very powerful. I've never had a software provider correct an error in my Excel spreadsheet, but my Excel spreadsheet has corrected an error in the software provider many, many times. And then the last 2 key takeaways I'll leave with you is, you know, start with big emission sources and iterate over time. Don't let the lack of data set you back. Don't let perfection delay progress, as I have there. You want to get on this as soon as you can. You'll become more familiar with the jargon. You'll be more familiar with the activity data, and you'll build those relationships over time of those people you need in facilities and accounting. So yeah, start with the big ones and go from there. And move forward with confidence. You know, we do need to know who collects the data. We need that inventory management plan, when we're going to update things, how the results will be used. All this needs to be in document as well, not just carbon number at the end of the day, but we need a document that follows all this. The verifier is going to want to see our numbers, but they're going to want to ask of how we've chosen the control that we did, or our boundary that we did, why we chose to do location and market like we did, all these things. And you want to avoid or limit the number of questions a verifier is asking back to you. And so by having that in the inventory management plan can be very effective. Okay, Peter, I think that's all I have for material. So if there's any questions, I'd love to take them.
Yeah, no further questions at this time, Kyle. So I think we can go ahead and close the session. I would let people know that we actually, of course, always have upcoming trainings, and I will pop a few of those in the one of those in the chat now, and you can always look at the saveonenergytraining.ca for all upcoming trainings. We also, the Save on Energy offers post-webinar supports. There's a monthly bulletin that you can sign up for to receive updates on upcoming trainings. The calendar I just mentioned, and there's also a training and support web page. Again, this slide deck will be provided to all attendees. And just give me 1 minute, Kyle. I'm reading a question to see if it pertains to what you presented.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay, this pertains directly to what you had just presented. And the question is, how should we handle the reporting phase if we don't have enough data and need to use average factors from the government and square footage?
Yeah, be very transparent. So we don't want to avoid reporting, but you do have to make your own decision on that. If you feel that, half of your footprint is really poor averages, then I might suggest that you wait a year to release anything public or have anything reported. But it's not common, especially if you're undertaking this, to just show your gaps, show you how you're going to address them and move forward. If you are speaking specifically about CDP, they just want your information. The more you give, the better. But I would start as soon as possible for sure. But yeah, don't worry if you're chasing some of those factors, they will get better over time. But I would suggest, you have to do your due diligence, because you don't want to just rely on some of those spend-based or averages. You want to get them more accurate over time. But yeah, don't let that delay progress by any means.
Thank you for the response, Kyle, and thank you for this really interesting and very practical and hands-on training today. And thanks, even more importantly, to the audience who spent 90 minutes or almost 90 minutes with us today and had some great questions for Kyle. Keep an eye out for the follow-up training. We're going to have a follow-up training run by Kyle on Scope 3 emissions for the commercial sector. This will be coming up likely in the fall, followed up by a net zero training. So this is the pathway that we're going on for the commercial sector. So thank you very much for your time, and we wish you a good rest of the day.
Thank you.